Maseches Eruvin, chapter 6. The name of the chapter is Hadar. We start with the Mishnah 75a1. So someone who lives in a chotzer must join in an Eruv, or he will restrict it. Either you join or you're restricting. The Mishnah elaborates on the effect someone's right of passage. He has a right to this chotzer, to this movie. Someone's right of passage has on a chotzer. What type of right of passage are we talking about? So shte chatzeros zu lifnei mizu, two chatzeros, as you see in the diagram, which are arranged one behind the other. The inner one joined in an eruv, but the outer one did not join in an eruv. The inner one is permitted, and the outer one is restricted. If the outer joined in an eruv and the inner one did not, so both of them are restricted. So why is it that in the case of the outer one, both restricted? The case of the inner one, only the outer one is restricted? We'll see. If this one joined in its own eruv, and that one joined in its own eruv, each one created his own eruv. Rabbi Akiva prohibits the outer chotzer, because the right of passage of the inner chotzer restricts the outer one. The sages say, the right of passage does not restrict the outer one. So the Mishnah now discusses cases where both chatzeros had an eruv, but both were invalid. If the outer chotzer, if one resident of the outer chotzer forgot and did not join in the eruv of his chotzer, pnimis muteres, the inner one is permitted, and the outer one is restricted. Min of pnimis v'eruv, if one person from the inner chotzer forgot and did not join in the eruv, both of them are restricted. So this is really one resident of the outer chotzer forgot, did not join in the eruv. The inner one is still permitted. One person from the inner chotzer forgot, did not stand a source. Until now, the Mishnah has discussed cases in which each chotzer had its own eruv. The Mishnah discusses cases where the two chatzeros had joined together in one common eruv. If they placed the joint eruv in one place, two chatzeros put together an eruv. Up till now it was a separate eruv, each one doing his own thing. And one resident of either the inner chotzer or the outer one forgot and did not join in the eruv shten asuros, both chatzeros are restricted. If the two chatzeros were inhabited by individuals, they need not join in the eruv.
What is in, what is out, right? The inner and the outer in this picture. Inner and outer. What is the difference?
These two houses.
The out one
From the back?
next to the Rishus Harabim, the bottom.
So the back houses are...
Meaning, these guys cannot go out of their courtyard without going through this one.
Yeah, okay.
So that's why it's called the outer one, because it has access to the public, and the inner one has no way of getting out unless going through. That's the rite of passage that we're talking about. It's like in the world of real estate, for example, if you buy a tract of land and then the land behind you is being developed, but they have no access to their land without going through your land. They have to pay you.
To access.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a lot. But in this case, if it was built this way, it was designed this way, the Gemara speaks about cases like this where someone bought a house. The guy can sell him, I sold you the house, I didn't sell you the access to the house. So that could be
There's a thing
two
about
separate
that.
deal. Yeah. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva stated that the rite of passage, even of someone who is permitted in his own chotzer, restricts. Right? Restricts. He has the power to restrict. The Gemara clarifies the position of the sages who disagree with Rabbi Akiva. Here also Rav Dimi came to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael. Babyloni. Amar Rabbi Yanai, Zudir Rabbi Akiva Dama. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva, who says, Afilu regel amuteres b'mkemo, seres shelei b'mkemo. Even the foot of a person who is permitted in his own place restrict a place not its own by its rite of passage. So again, even the foot of a person who is permitted in his own place is allowed to do his own thing in his chotzer, restrict a place not its own by its rite of passage. The fact that he has the rite of passage, according to Rabbi Akiva, he can restrict. That's the position of Rabbi Akiva. Aval chachomim omrim, rabbis say, Shem sheregel amuteres b'neser, just as the foot of a person who is permitted in his own place does not restrict another place by its rite of passage, kach regel ha'asua ein oser, so too the foot of a person who is restricted in his own place does not restrict another place by its rite of passage. So this is really the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, if the rite of passage gives you the power to restrict or not. The Gemara challenges of Dimi understanding of the sage's opinion. Tenan learned in the first part of our mission. Eruv chitzon pnimis, if the outer chotzer joined in an eruv, the one that is facing Shusorabim, public domain, and the inner one did not. The inner chotzer did not join in the eruv. Shten asuris, both chotzeros are restricted. This implies that had the inner chotzer joined in its own eruv, both chatzeros would be permitted. So Gemara says, Mani, who does this ruling follow? If you say that this ruling follows Rabbi Akiva, why does it say regular asura? Why bother with a case of the foot of a person who is restricted in its own chotzer? Afilu regel muteres nami. Even the foot of a person who is permitted in his own chotzer restricts another chotzer. It says in 23, Rabbi Akiva, the end of the Mishnah states that Rabbi Akiva prohibits the outer chotzer even when each chotzer joined in an eruv. In that case, people who are permitted, why? For the fact that they didn't make an eruv together, meaning they did, they each one had his eruv, but they didn't participate in one eruv. So Rabbi Akiva prohibits the outer chotzer even when each chotzer joined in an eruv. In that case, people who are permitted in their own inner chotzer restrict the outer chotzer by their rite of passage through it. Why then would Rabbi Akiva have to rule in the case being discussed that people who are restricted? He already ruled when people are not restricted, people are permitted, and they're still restricting. Why then would Rabbi Akiva have to rule in a case being discussed that people who are restricted in their own chotzer because they didn't, due to the lack of eruv, restrict the outer chotzer as well? It's like obvious. Rabbi Akiva was more machmir, was more strict in a case of an Eruv, according to this. Even if you have right in your own Chotzer, you're still restricting because you didn't make an Eruv with the other ones. So why do we have to discuss a case of that they didn't make an Eruv? Obviously, a case of didn't make an Eruv is still restricting. Not a joint Eruv, even if they didn't make a personal Eruv, they're restricting. Ella lav rabbanon. So rather, is it not the rabbis, the sages? It is apparent that the rabbis rule leniently only in a case of a person who is permitted in his own chotzer. It says, actually, this ruling does follow Rabbi Akiva. And the Mishnah teaches this rule in the style of not only this, but even this, which means not only does a chotzer, which is itself restricted, restrict the outer chotzer, but even a chotzer which is itself permitted, restrict the outer chotzer. It's just the other way around. Don't think that only chotzer that is restricted, restricting another, but also chotzer that is permitted restricts another chotzer. So you see the power of the inner chotzer over the outer one. Tenan, we learned in the Mishnah, was zulatzmo, v'zulatzmo. If this one joined in its own Eruv, and that one joined in its own Eruv. Zumutelz v'natzmo, zumutelz v'natzmo. This one is permitted on its own, and that one is permitted on its own. Time of the Eruv, the reason they are permitted is because the inner one joined in an Eruv. Halo Eruv, but if the inner one not joining an Eruv, Shtein asurs, both of them would be restricted. V'ha aitano, the Omar. Now this is a Tana who said, Regel hamuteres eino iseres. Regel ha'asura oiseres. The foot of a person who is permitted does not restrict. Only the foot of a person who is restricted restricts. Mani, who is this Tana? Ilim Rabbi Akiva again. If you will try to say that it's Rabbi Akiva, afilu regel hamuteres nami, even the foot which is permitted also restrict the other chotzer. El alav rabbonani. Rather, is it not the rabbis? Question mark. Ve'oid. And furthermore, must be the rabbis' ruling. Be the Sefer Rabbi Akiva, since the end of the Mishnah is explicitly attributed to Rabbi Akiva, it implies Reish halav Rabbi Akiva. The beginning of the Mishnah is not following Rabbi Akiva. It is thus apparent that the rabbis rule leniently only in a case of a person who is permitted in his own chotzer. Kulu Rabbi Akiva is the entire first part of the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva, Chasur Mechasra V'Achik Ketani. And it is as if the Mishnah were missing words, and this is what it teaches. If this chotzer joined in its own Eruv, and that one joined in its own Eruv, this one is permitted on its own, and this one is permitted on its own. So the Mishnah qualifies this. The Mishnah qualifies this ruling. In one case, these words said Sodako, when the inner chotzer erected a small door at the entrance to the outer chotzer to renounce its right of passage through it. So by putting a door, we're renouncing its right. So that makes it a different case. But if it did not erect a small door, the outer one is restricted. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva prohibits the outer chotzer. Why? Because the right of passage restricts, even if the holder of that right is permitted in his own chotzer. But the sages say the right of passage does not restrict. Also, Rabbi Barabai of Bibi Barabai challenged of Dimi from the last ruling of the Mishnah. If the two chatzeros were inhabited by individuals, meaning it's not a few families, it's one family, they need not join in an Eruv. This implies that the resident of the inner chotzer, singular, the resident of the inner chotzer does not restrict the outer chotzer only because he's permitted in his own inner chotzer.
Why you don't have to join if they're only single people?
Let's see, he's explaining. So it says, this implies that the resident of the inner chotzer does not restrict the outer chotzer only because he's permitted in his own inner chotzer, shel rabim. But if the inner chotzer was inhabited by many households, I guess the whole idea of Eruv is that you can carry from your house to other people's houses. If it's one person, I guess, yeah. If it's one person, I guess she's saying you still go to his house.
Yeah, I can go to your house if you want.
Yeah, but you
So
can't carry. The problem is not just walking. It's
But
carrying.
why they don't have to join the roof?
The whole thing is about
No, he's saying they can carry, right? Look, he says, if the two chatzeros were inhabited by individuals, they need not join in an Eruv, right? They need not join in an Eruv. This implies that the resident of the inner chotzer does not restrict the outer chotzer, only because it is permitted in his own chotzer. But if the inner chotzer was inhabited by many households, then they would need to join in Eruv. Why? Because of the inner chotzer's right of passage. We see from this that the foot of a person who is permitted in his own place does not restrict another chotzer. He says, but the foot of a person who is restricted in his own place restrict another chotzer by its right of passage. Let's see.
Saying that, okay.
This cannot follow Rabbi Akiva because he holds that the outer chotzer is restricted even when the inner chotzer did not join an Eruv. By process of elimination, it must follow that the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva. It is therefore apparent that only if the inner chotzer was permitted on its own, either because it had joined in an Eruv or because only one person lived here, the rabbis permit the outer chotzer. This refutes of Dimi's understanding. It says over here, if you look at the where was it? Right here. It says in 20, each chotzer contained only one inhabited house. And then it says 21. Why? He's answering it. So he writes, since the inner chotzer is permitted, its right of passage does not restrict the outer chotzer, according to the rabbis who dispute with Rabbi Akiva. If either of the chatzers contained two residents, the outer chotzer would be restricted. If the inner chotzer contained two residents, it would be restricted and consequently would restrict the outer with its right of passage. Now, even if the outer chotzer contained two residents and the inner chotzer only one, would restrict. We ban the outer chotzer in order to avoid confusing it with the case in which the inner chotzer and the outer chotzer has one. Rashi writes, he says, if the inner chotzer has only one person and the other chotzer has one, they don't need to have Eruv one with the other, mishum drisas regel, just because it has the right of passage. Why? The kevan the yochidu, since he is one, is singular. Va'pnimis havir regel hamuteres. The inner one has its right of passage, regel muteres, ve'eno iseres, and does not restrict. V'stamo kerabonon, and most likely it's the opinion of the rabbis. But if it's two people already in the outer one, it becomes a problem. So it seems like that the right. What's the reason why? The one restricts the other. Remember, it's maybe we should say differently. It's not really the issue at hand is the carrying aspect. The issue at hand in the Mishnah is the restricting aspect.
Meaning, rite of passage.
The rite of passage is determining whether I'm restricting you or not. But we're not dealing with so much about the actual carrying issue, rather than we're dealing with restricting. Meaning, if I do my own thing, do I restrict you or not? So in the case of only one person living, they're not restricting each other according to this. It says they need not join in an Eruv, therefore they're not restricting each other, they're not dependent on each other, even though the inner guy has the right of passage, has the right to go from the inside yard to the outside yard. But let's see, I'm sure the Gemara will discuss it further. Ravina also challenged Rav Dimi from another section of the Mishnah. If one resident of the outer chotzer forgot and did not join in the Eruv of his chotzer. Right? One forgot. There's many people living there in the outer chotzer, but one forgot to join in the Eruv. Apnimis muteros, the inner one is permitted. V'chitzon asur, and the outer one is restricted. Now the other way around. One of the residents of the inner chotzer forgot and did not join in the Eruv. Shtein asuris, both of them are restricted, the inner and the outer. Why? The reason that the inner chotzer restrict the outer is that someone forgot to join in Eruv, causing the inner chotzer to be restricted. But if he had not forgotten, but had joined the Eruv, Shtei mutoros, both would be permitted. Alma, what do we see from it? Regel muteres eino iseres. We see from this that the foot of a person who is permitted in his own place does not restrict another chotzer. Regel asura iseres, but the foot of a person who is restricted in his own place does restrict another chotzer by its rite of passage. So Rav Dimi is therefore refuted. Let's see. So over here it says, when the two courtyards belong to individuals, meaning that each courtyard has only one person, they don't need to make an Eruv with each other, and they're both allowed to carry in his yard, but not from one to the other. Over here he clarifies it.
But one of them doesn't have yard.
No, both have yards. They both have yards. When you say inner chotzer and outer chotzer, they both have yards. The only difference is that the outer chotzer leads to public domain. The inner chotzer only leads to the outer. So look at this way. So this is the inner chotzer. This is the outer chotzer.
And this is Shotabim?
This is a public domain.
Okay.
So these guys have to go through here to get to public domain. Now, he tells us that if this guy lived by himself, and this guy lived by himself, he can carry in his own chotzer, and he can carry in his own chotzer, but they can't carry to each other.
Okay.
That's because they didn't make an Eruv. Okay. So when they say they don't need to make an Eruv, means that they don't need to make an Eruv to carry in their own yard. But if more than one person would be living here, in the inner chotzer, they would have to make an eruv just to carry over here. If they want to carry over here too, they also have to make an eruv. They have to participate in eruv. That's a different story. But to carry in this yard,
They don't need to join the roof.
if you just live by yourself, you don't need to make an eruv. But if
To carry
a few families living, to carry here.
Oh, okay.
And these guys also, if he live by himself, he doesn't need to make an eruv to carry in his own yard.
Okay.
Why? Because your yard is your yard.
Okay.
The only issue is when a lot of people are entering the same yard, are living in so your yard. If I live in your yard, meaning I have a house that faces your yard, right? A house here, a house here, a house here, a house here, and they all have access to this yard. Then it's not yours; it's mine also. I have a part of it. You have his, and therefore we need to make an eruv in order because it's somewhat has an aspect of reshus harabim. Someone has, to some degree, it has an aspect of a public domain.
Okay.
Why? Because everyone can enter. So, Elak Yosel Rabin, Amar Rabbi Yanai, rather when Rabin came from Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yanai, give Machlokes Badov, there are actually three opinions in this matter. Tana Kama Sova, the Tana Kama holds, Regular Muteres says the foot of a person who is permitted in his own chotzer does not restrict the outer chotzer. Regular Asura says, but the foot who is restricted in his own chotzer restrict the outer one. Rabbi Akiva Sova, Afilu Regular Muteres says. Rabbi Akiva says even a foot of a person who is permitted in his own chotzer restrict the outer one. Verabon Basoy Sova, the latter rabbis, the sages hold. Just as the foot of a person who is permitted does not restrict, so too the foot of a person who is restricted does not restrict. I have to stop here and we'll continue. When do you think we can continue? Is it a good time?
When are you coming back, before?